most amazing artist. I hope you are having an awesome day today. Today we're going to be practicing creating a value scale. Value is an element of art that artists will use to add shadows, midtones, and highlights to their artwork. We're going to practice first, and we're going to use a couple different materials to see which one we like the best to use for our final artwork. And as you can see, I have a sheet in front of me that I'm going to be using today, and if you're in my face-to-face classes, you're going to get something exactly like this. But if you're in my online classes, this is going to be on your Google Classroom. If you are able to print it out, then you can. However, you do not have to print this out. You can just get a normal piece of paper. Could be blank, it could be just regular notebook paper, and you can draw some boxes and rectangles and just follow the same directions that are on this sheet, but you can just copy it onto another piece of paper. Okay, so all I need to do this today is my practice paper, whether I printed it out or I drew some boxes and squares on another piece of paper. I have a pencil, and for me, I also have crayons. However, if you read the directions up here, it says use crayons, oil pastels, color pencils, or a regular pencil to complete this activity. So for number 1 and 2, we're going to use just one material. For me, I'm going to use just a regular pencil, but you could use colored pencils, oil pastels, crayons. And then number 3 is asking us to color from lightest to darkness using a different material. So for example, if you use crayons for 1 and 2, try using colored pencils now for number 3. We want to practice in different materials so then we can choose which one is our favorite to use for our final. So I'm ready to get started. I've decided for number 1 and 2, I'm just going to use a pencil, and for number 3, I want to try to create value using some crayons. So what I need to do first is, of course, write my name in the space above, and then I'm going to start on number 1, and it says color the boxes from lightest to darkest. So over here, the first square is lightest, and each square it says a bit darker, get a bit darker, a bit darker, dark, and then the very darkest. So with my pencil, what I'm going to do is whenever I do this, I like to start with the lightest, and I am just going to add a little bit of color with my pencil. And you're going to do the same exact thing if you're using another material, whether it's crayons, colored pencils, whatever the case may be. And I am just barely touching my paper, and I'm just filling this box in. This is practice, so it's okay if we go outside of the lines as long as we're not rushing or scribbling. It might go outside the lines, and that's totally fine. But try not to scribble, because then it's going to be really messy and we won't really get that good of a practice if we're scribbling for our final. So just make sure that you're taking your time and you're really focusing and practicing to do this before you start adding value to your final. Okay, so there's my lightest. I can always go back and lighten it up if I need to with my eraser. And now for the second box, it's telling me to go a bit darker, so I'm gonna press down a little bit harder, not a lot, because we don't want this to be the darkest. We want the darkest one to be all the way at the end. What we're trying to do is create something called a gradient. A gradient is when the lightest color you have will slowly get darker and darker and darker. You don't want to go from your lightest straight to your darkest, because then that gradient will not blend. So that's why we just do a little bit of darkness at a time. So I'm going to go to my next box, and I'm going to press down just a little bit harder. Not too much, just a little bit, because this is not my darkest yet. But I want it to be darker than my last box I did. So I'm going to press down a little bit harder. And you might notice I am just going up and down. I'm using up and down motions to fill up this space. And I'm kind of using the side of my pencil to just gradually add that color to each box. Next one, a bit darker. So what do you think I'm going to do? Yep, I'm going to press down a little bit harder. And I have a messy mat under my work, so you probably see some of that texture showing up underneath. But if you're just doing this on a flat desk, then you won't have that. So let me press down a bit harder than my last one. All right, I only have 2 more to go. And I'm gonna press down even harder than I was on that one, but I'm still not pressing down as hard as I need to for my darkest. And I just want this one to be darker than the last one. Okay, adding value with any of these materials listed above is all about the pressure of your pencil. And we're always talking about drawing it light till you get it right. This is the same idea, is we're barely touching the paper with the lightest, and then we'll slowly press down a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit harder, until you get to the darkest, and then I'm gonna press down the hardest. Not like super hard to where you break your pencil, but hard enough to where it's the darkest and it creates the shadow for your value scale. So I'm comparing it to my last one, and I think I could go over it one more time and just try to make it a little bit darker. If you can't get it any darker, then that means that these ones might be a little bit too dark. So you can take your eraser and go in and erase any areas that might be too dark, and that looks pretty good. So there are my boxes from lightest to darkest. If I want it to be darker, then I'm pressing down harder. If I want it to be lighter, then I'm barely touching my paper. So let's go to number 2. Now color from lightest to darkness without the lines. So without the boxes, I'm gonna start lightest over here, just like this one above, and then I'm gonna slowly make it darker and darker and darker and darker until I get to the darkest. So up here at the lightest, I'm barely touching, and as I get closer to the darker, I am slowly pressing it down just a little bit at a time, and then pressing down a little bit harder now, even harder. And I want to go back over some areas because I want to make sure I get all that white space. And going over the same area twice will also help your tones blend in together a little bit more. This one is exactly the same up here, except for I'm just making one gradual gradient. Instead of doing it step by step, I'm just doing one entire thing. And I'm gonna go back in the opposite direction. And as I get towards the midtones and my lightest areas, I'm bringing my pencil up a little bit and barely touching my paper. That looks pretty good. You can go back in if you need to blend certain areas, like if it's kind of choppy looking, you want it to be a gradient. That means it is a gradual change from light to dark. You can go over some areas again with the right amount of pressure. And I notice I have a very dark area right here. So I'm gonna try to blend that in to my darkest area. That looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna switch my material because I've had enough practice with the pencil. I got it. And for number 3, we're just gonna choose one color of whichever material you have chosen. So I'm choosing crayons, and I am just going to choose purple. And it's the same exact idea as number 1 and number 2. Barely press down where it's the lightest, and then gradually start pressing down a little bit as you get closer to the darkest area. And that's just one layer, so I'm gonna go back in with my crayon, and I am going to start pressing down a lot harder, not to where I'm gonna accidentally snap my crayon in half. Sometimes with crayons and oil pastels, you can choose a darker color, like maybe since I've done blue, maybe I wanna go in with indigo in my darkest and kind of layer those colors on top, and try to blend those two colors together, and that will make your darkest shadow a lot darker if you want to. I think it's a good idea if you are using crayons or oil pastels or even colored pencils to try to layer different colors on top of one another, because sometimes they can make very beautiful colors, especially when they're blended together nicely. So even though I'm getting up to my lightest area, I am just not pressing down as hard, and that's already made my shadow a lot darker over here. When you're trying to blend shadows or colors or highlights, midtones, the key is to doing lots of layers. So I went in with a base layer here, and now I'm going in with other layers of darker colors to really blend those together. And now for number 4, it's asking me which one is my favorite. Did I enjoy doing the pencil more, or did I enjoy using crayons more? I think I enjoyed using crayons more because I just love color. I love the element of art color. So in my artwork, I really love to use lots of color. And if I was to choose just pencil up here as my favorite, then my entire drawing would just be black and gray and white, which is totally fine if that's what you want for yours. But for mine, I love color, so I think my favorite is crayons. Okay, so after you do 1, 2, 3, and 4 using a couple different materials, then you will be done for today. I hope you guys enjoy practicing some value and really blending those values together from lightest to darkest and playing around with a couple different materials. I can't wait to see how your value scale practice sheets turn out. I know they're going to be amazing because you guys are amazing. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Bye guys.